The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the January 2020 Teaching and Learning for Student Success monthly webinar. Thank you for joining us today in what will be an amazing talk with Dr. Lucelma Canales of UTRGV. My name is Erin Doran. This is the first time that I will be facilitating the webinar, so thank you to my wonderful predecessor, Lidia Sudavaca, who left some awesome shoes for me to fill in terms of leading us through this webinar. Something that I wanted to highlight before we jump into Dr. Canales's presentation is just who we are. If you're unfamiliar with Catch the Next, Catch the Next is a wonderful organization operating in the institutions across Texas. Our website, catchthenext.org, offers a lot of information about the programs we run, our events, the people who work to support our programs across the colleges, and then ways to support Catch the Next. Some things that we definitely want to highlight are our monthly webinars, which are normally held every third Thursday at 3 p.m. of the month. We are in the process of updating the website, and we'll have the February details posted to the website shortly. We also provide important professional development opportunities across the state, and so some events that are coming up in the spring semester that I want to highlight are forgive me for being out of order. This is my first time doing it. The save the dates I wanted to highlight would be the Transformative Teaching Track Seminar on March 26th and 27th in McAllen, Texas, as well as the Ascender Spring Seminar from March 27th to March 28th, also in McAllen. If the colleges have any news from either the end of the semester or the beginning of the semester that they want to share, please send those to our communications guru, Deborah McBeath, and her email address is there. And as I said, our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, February 20th from 3 to 4 p.m. And if you're already registered for the normal seminars or webinars, you should go ahead and get those email reminders. So before we begin and I hand it over to Dr. Canales, I just wanted everybody to know that all attendees come to the webinar muted. So if your computer and audio are not working or something is a little funky, you can change the audio to phone call. That should be able to help you troubleshoot. If you have a question during the presentation, you can type it in the questions and answers panel, the Q&A panel, and we'll make sure that that question gets posed to Dr. Canales. Also, after her presentation, we will have a Q&A session with her. So if you want to wait and be able to ask the question for yourself, you can use the hand raise feature. Other than that, I'm going to go ahead and change the presenter to Dr. Canales, and we will get started.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I've been fighting a really bad allergy attack for about 3 weeks, so I'm barely getting my voice back. And so if I start coughing or something, please excuse me during the presentation. Some of you may have seen a version of this back in, and that should say January 2020, right? Some of you may have seen a version of this in Austin back in 2019, but Lydia thought that it would be appropriate for those who did not get to participate and to see this, and maybe even just to reemphasize the importance of equity in the work that we're doing. And it's a really interesting time to be looking at equity. As I think about my own institution and some of the institutions that are part of Catch the Next throughout the state, many of us are predominantly Latino. We're like a 90% or more enrollment in Latino. So what does equity look like for our campuses? And so when we walk through this, I know that there's a national context, there's a state context, but I also want you to look at your own context of your own institution based on on where you are on your journey and the population of students that you serve. Because although the information is very similar, the questions that we ask ourselves are slightly different depending on the context that we're in. And so we'll get started with that. And I'm going to start with really thinking about, what we know about the student experience. But as it says on the title, I want us to think about the student experience and reimagine it if we were thinking about it from an equity lens. And so that's kind of why the title is that. So as we think about the student experience, it's important to look at, like, what do we know? And so a lot of what we know is through data that's out there. So the national profile is the first thing that we know. We know that too few students are completing their degrees on time, right? And so this isn't new to us. This is old news. Complete College America and other institutions have been hammering us for a decade or more on the results. Very, very few students, and this isn't just a community college issue, it's a four-year institution. If we have the numbers for the privates and others, this is an issue throughout the country. And so when we think about full-time students, for only 15% of them or 16% of them to even finish a 1 to 2 year certificate on time is just not good. And then as we think about it from an equity lens later, within those groups, the data gets skewed because not all students are finishing in the same way. And so when we continue to think about this, and think about, for those that even do finish, think about how long it's taking them. And then when we think about the kids that are finishing a 1 and 2 year certificate, for them to be almost graduating with almost double the number of credits that it takes to get a certificate, that's another issue. And so students we know are floundering, they are coming in and out of our institutions. Same thing is true for the associate's degree. I know that it's getting tighter. As we think about our own institutions and the work that we're doing with dual credit students, one of the things, for example, as four-year institutions that we're having to do is pause and think about, what does it mean when kids are coming to us with dual credit? And I know that as universities, we have not always taken the responsibility for, well, what does it mean on how we onboard students and how we differentiate for them? And so when I talk about equity, that's what I'm also talking about, is how do students come to us from the community college? And then for the community college, the same thing. As you're working on your partnerships, are you setting kids up on a pathway to something, or are you just putting them on a pathway to credit accumulation? So as we think about these things, and then on the corner on the right-hand side, you can see what that means as kids prolong, I say kids, but as young adults prolong and the time to completion, we're beginning to have these conversations about, what does that mean in lost wages? So it's no longer just about getting them to complete, but we know that many of the students that we serve come to us from low resource communities, they come from low income families. And so the longer that they stay just floundering, the more the loss of wages that they have. And so as we continue for four-year institutions, like I said, this isn't a 2-year problem, it isn't a 4-year problem. It's just something that we all need to be looking at, because the lost wages are the same when you think about the number of credits that students are taking to complete a 4-year institution. And although we look at the flagships, the high research institutions, only 36% of their students are completing on time also. And so when we think about that, we need to think about, what are those things that are preventing students from making the journey to on-time progress to completion. And I know, we have these conversations almost on a daily basis, my staff and I know it's really easy for us to, kind of say, the life issues students come to us with are huge, and we all understand those. But some of the conversations that we're having is, but once we accept them in our institutions, we have a responsibility to think about what their experience looks like when they are with us, so that they can make their journey on to completion on a timely basis. And so now let's narrow it down to Texas. Texas isn't faring any better than the rest of the state. When you look at the 1 to 2 year certificates, that one really surprised me, that 0% of the kids are finishing in 1 year. It's actually taking them 3.4 years. When I started doing this work about 10 years ago, it used to be kind of mirroring the nation, but it's now moved up to almost 4 years. And when you look at the associate degrees, it's taking students about the same amount of time to finish a certificate than it is for them to finish an associate's degree. So when we also look at the excess credits, it's the same thing. Students are accumulating way too many credits. When we think about the 4-year institutions, like I said, they're not faring any better. It's taking students almost 6 years to complete a 4-year degree. In the flagships aren't doing any better. The interesting thing, I think, when we look at 4-year on-time completion, it's really important. I think if you look at what's happening in Texas, as we think about, when I get with my sister institutions throughout the state, most presidents are now being held accountable for a 4-year graduation rate, not just a 6-year graduation rate. And so this idea of, are they finishing, on time, is something that's getting more and more traction in the state as the legislative bodies begin to get more immersed in the business of higher ed. I think that if we don't begin to look at these things in a more careful and authentic way, the law is going to attempt to do this. And anytime the legislators get involved, we know that we may not end up with the kind of policies that we need that will help our students. And so when we look at rethinking, about maybe it was about 10 years ago, the coordinating board, along with the Houston Endowment, began to think about, the real test of whether what kids are doing and the experience for students really starts in the 8th grade. Because when we look at the 8th grade students and how many of them really complete high school, there are in the pipeline of even K through 12 all the way to higher ed, there are leaks throughout. The first major leak is really between 8th grade and their freshman year. So the coordinating board, along with the Houston Endowment, about 10 years ago, began to really study, the 8th grade cohort. And if you haven't looked at your 8th grade cohort as a community, I know in the Rio Grande Valley, we began to do this work very seriously in about 2013. The collective impact work that I used to lead through RGV Focus was created because of these numbers. So when you look at 8th graders that start school in 2006, there was like 100% of them, right? Only 74% of those finished high school. And so that's already a huge drop off. Of those then in Texas, only 54% enrolled in higher education. And of those then only 21% completed a certificate or higher. So when you begin to think about this and think about the 60 by 30 and think about the Lumina Foundation's goals and all of that, Texas is not making the kind of progress that we need to. And so as we think about the student experience and the connections that we're making for students, it's really important for us to think about what we're doing. And so this begins to open kind of the idea of what the student experience looks like beginning in 8th grade. And if those of you who remember House Bill 5 that forces 8th graders to begin to look at high school endorsements, if you think about Senate Bill 25 that we're still kind of in the rulemaking phase of that, that's going to force students who earn 15 credits in high school of dual credit to begin to declare a major, whatever that means, right? Students are being forced more and more to begin to think about pathways. So as institutions, we need to think about, like, what are we doing with our K through 12 partners? What are we doing between our community college and university partners to really begin to align this and align it in a really authentic way? I just went through a process of re-upping 22 articulation agreements between UTRGV and South Texas College. And it's really interesting to have the faculty sit at the table, and these are agreements we already had, and to think about like all of the obstacles, even within the articulation that we have. And we hope that we've addressed some of them through this new re-up, but we're going to now be meeting twice a year, university and community college, because we are really creating barriers for our students as we think about the courses that transfer, the ones that don't. And so we may be contributing to some of the issue of the time that it takes our students to finish. And so if you haven't looked at your 8th grade cohort, I would encourage you to do it. If there is a collective impact initiative in your community, reach out to them and see what they have in data that might support some of the work that you're doing. Because as we think about the 8th grade cohort, and we think about how students are doing depending on who they are, right? So when we think about Hispanic and African American students, they make out about 58% of the 8th grade cohort. But then when you think about from those that actually completed something 10 years later, only 39% of those degree or certificate completers were African American and Latinos. So these gaps that start early on continue to demonstrate themselves throughout the student experience. And so when we, and this is, like I said, this is data from the 8th grade cohort 4 that the coordinating board makes available. Then we also think about what does it mean for low-income students, right? And because when we think about the 21%, we're like, well, we're making progress. We've gone from 18% in 1997 to 21%. But when you look at the difference between students that are economically disadvantaged and those that are not, there's a huge difference. And when we think about that difference and look at the gap is actually widening for students that are economically disadvantaged. So not only is it important for us to look at the overall, but this is the first cut. This is the first cut of what does it mean. And I will tell you that I have to question myself, and my team and I are always questioning, but what does it mean for us when 80% of our kids are on some form of financial aid, right? What does that mean for us? And so as we think about that, and think about the ethnicity also, think about what that means for you. And is this cut of data sufficient for you? Or is there something more that you need to be asking yourself? Because when we look at the Hispanic versus the African American, you see the same thing. The interesting thing here is the interactions between the African American and the Latino or Hispanic students. You know, it's kind of, they keep trading places, right? And somewhere around 2004, they kind of met up and had the exact same outcomes. And then the Latinos or the Hispanics are now about 2% higher. I mean, it's not enough years now to see if that trend is going to continue, but we really do need to think about what does that mean for our African American students. And as you can see, for our white students, they continue to make progress. So a question was posed to us by the Center of Urban Education. And if you know their work, I'll introduce you a little bit to the work that they do on equity in a little bit. But when you think about that and think about, is it better that everyone is growing at the same rate? I mean, do we want to accept that everybody grew 4% and we're comfortable because everyone is growing? Or do we also have a responsibility to close the gap? And that's a conversation that you need to have as a team when you look at this data. So as an institution, do you accept that, you know, whatever proposition is, and you can lay those out on the whiteboard and say, do we just want everyone to continue to grow at the same rate so everyone grows 5%? Or do we need the groups that are performing at a lower level to grow at an accelerated rate? And those are conversations you need to have at your institution. I don't know what the answer is for your institution, right? Because the context matters. But it is important to have the conversation. And I'll share with you in a bit also some tools that you can use to engage your faculty and staff in conversations about making sense of this. And I think way too many times I've gone to sessions where folks kind of lay the work and they say, this is what you need to be doing, and this is the right answer, and this is the wrong answer. I'm not even sure that there is a right or wrong answer, or we would have already figured this out. But the fact that all of this continues to persist, the fact that we have dedicated 2 decades of time, if not more, to try and solve the equity issue of disparities amongst Latinos, African American, and white students, among economically disadvantaged and other students, and we're still, the gaps continue. It may be time for us to be asking ourselves a different question. And maybe we need to step back and say, what are the questions we need to be asking of the data that are a little different, that might help us better understand why we're not able to close the gap? And so I'm going to now take you into the TSI data, right? Because this is also very telling when you look at the difference on how students are doing depending on their ethnicity. So I know this is a lot of data for you to look at, so I'm going to zero in on it's the same chart, but I'm only going to look at 2013 and 2017. And this is what's really concerning to me, because between 2013 and 2017, we all know how much work has been done, how much work was being done even before that. I mean, I can remember when we started our student success work back in 2004 with Achieving the Dream, and then in 2008 or 2009, the Developmental Education Initiative. And then we began with Completion by Design. And now it's the guided pathways. So it's not for the lack of trying. Folks are doing all that they can do. There's early college high schools now. We're testing kids in 8th grade, in 9th grade, in 10th grade. And yet the numbers are not improving. They're actually getting worse, right? The gaps are increasing. And we know that there have been some policy changes in both TA and the coordinating board on how college readiness is measured. But regardless of that, the gaps continue. So it's affecting everyone in the same way, right? So when the definition was changed for college readiness, it affected all the groups the same way. Everyone went down. But what's concerning to me is that as much as Texas is investing in trying to look at college readiness, our data isn't getting any better. So when we think about it, then when we look at math, writing, and reading, we continue to see the gaps among the student groups. So when you look at African Americans at 43.7, and this is of those that are college ready in all areas, Latinos at 53%, and then whites at 72%. We have to ask ourselves, have we really been asking ourselves the right questions about what's working and not working, and why? Or is it that we're piloting things in small groups of students and we know what works, but we don't scale it to have huge impact on all of our students? And as we think about equity mindedness and what it means to do what we know is in the best interest, those are questions that we have to ask ourselves. In the collective impact work, I learned to do after action reviews after every initiative. It's a form of assessment, but it includes being able to have dialogue around what, making sense of what did we expect was going to happen, what actually happened, and then the asking of the why, the what worked well and what didn't, what could we have done different, and then capitalizing on that to close the loop and improve things, right? And I'm not sure that we're consistently doing all of that, because the numbers are showing us that we're not making the kind of progress that we believe we should making with all the work and effort and all of the hard work that folks are doing at their institutions. Because as we look at the gender, I think this is one where we're beginning, at least amongst the genders, to see some impact. As you look at the genders, if you remember, there used to be these huge disparities between males and females in key, either in math or in reading or in writing. And we're seeing this now be narrowed. I will tell you, though, that when I look at this from a TA perspective, I'm on a school board, and when we look at these, our special populations and our ESL students are not performing at the level that they need to. So our school districts have issues that they need to continue to talk about. But remember that their students are our students. And as open access, open enrollment institutions, the students are all welcome to come onto our campuses. And as the percentage of students that go to college right after high school continues to increase, I know in the Valley we're up to like 59% in the first fall right after high school graduation. That means that we're digging deeper into our lower quartiles to bring our students in. So students are coming to us with different needs, but yet we're still serving them in the same way that we've always served all students. So once again, I think the challenge is that we need to step back and think about who are our students, not just, African American, Latino, low income. No, like who really are our students? How are they coming to us? And so as we ask ourselves that, we need to think about the difference between equality and equity. And most of you have seen this, and I share this because I think that when we think about equality versus equity, there's an assumption that everyone will benefit from the same support, right? So everyone has to go to advising, everyone has to go to orientation, everyone has to do whatever it is that they need to do. So we know that. However, we do also know that students come to us with differentiated lives, right? With different life experience, with different things. So the model that has been talked about with us about equity versus equality then also has for a long time assumed, well, what if we give them a little bit different support? Let's get the kids that are not college ready to take a learning frameworks course, a college success course. Well, let's have them participate in a learning community. Well, let's have these kids do supplemental instruction, whatever it is that they're doing, right? So for us, then it becomes, well, then let's give those students that we know need something a little extra so that they can see over the fence, right? The more newer one that from this particular frame of talking about equity is to put, to remove the hard fence and it's supposed to be symbolic of the barriers being removed. The issue that I have with this one is that they're all still seeing it from the outside, right? So the fact that there's still a hurricane fence in front of them means that we really haven't dug deep into the policies and practices and the systemic barriers that need to be looked at in order to determine whether students are really coming to us with an equitable opportunity at success. So I'm a real fan, and I don't know how many of you have really gone deep into the work of the Center for Urban Education, but I'm a huge fan of their work, and I've been looking at their work to really inform my own way of thinking and the work that I do in my own institutions and when I was doing the collective impact work in my entire region about what equity means as we think about, right? And so as we imagine the world, right, we imagine that like every that everything is equal. So as long as we give everyone the same tools, they'll all get to that diploma, right? So I care about all students equally. And I still hear a lot of this when I go visit my Achieving the Dream schools. I hear it here at my own institution at UTRGV. Well, we care about all students. Well, that's not a wrong statement to make. However, it may not necessarily mean that all students come to us equal, right? Equally prepared or with equal resources and supports. So this infographic for me tells a huge story. The story of, I think about myself and back in the 80s when I started at the university, I came in as a migrant farm worker who went to as many school, as 3 to 5 schools a year. We were part of all kinds of disruptions in the school year for my sisters and I. We didn't have access to AP courses. I had to fight to get calculus in the 0 hour. I don't know how many of you are old enough to know what the 0 hour is, but we literally had to petition and find 12 students that were willing to go into school at 7 in the morning so that we could take calculus, because calculus was not available at my high school at that time. But yet a school in McAllen, 40 minutes east of me actually had it throughout the day and had all of those things. They had ACT prep for their students. So this infographic for me talks about, like, this is how our kids are coming to us. And then we do have kids that are coming to us from communities that are poorly funded schools that may have, you know, that may have teachers that are maybe don't have the kind of tenure and experience, that may not have the kind of counseling support that they need, and other things. And if you've never looked in your high schools and your middle school, like at your teacher landscape, we actually took a look at our teacher landscape in the Valley. And believe it or not, compared to the state, the Valley is doing an exceptional job with its teacher tenure. And it's really important to look at, because as school districts are investing in teachers, there are some school districts throughout the state that are losing half of their new teachers by year 2 or 3. That's a huge amount of teachers to lose. So as we look at that, that's part of the assets that students either bring with them or not, right? And if as a parent or as a professor or as an administrator, you're aware of the disruption that happens when students are almost having to be the guinea pigs for a landscape of brand new teachers. And sometimes brand new teachers are the best thing that they can get. But there is a correlation between how students do and the quality of the teachers that they have. The other thing is, that we have school districts that have, that have scholarship counselors that help their students, work on getting ready. If you look, I don't know how many of you actually look at this, but I do. How many of your kids in the region that you're in are Gate Millennials, Dell Scholars? The Valley, the last time I looked at this about 5 years ago, 30% of the Gate Millennial scholarships that were given across the country were given to kids in the Valley. So we began to understand the role of being able to prepare our students to be competitive in the scholarships. The educated parents, 39% of the adults in the Valley still lack a high school diploma or a GED. And in some communities it's higher, in others is a little lower. But how can a parent that doesn't have the kind of education that now I have, my kids compared to where I was, how do we expect them to be able to help their students? So I love this infographic because it shares some of that. Then compound this, and whether institutions are ready to have the courageous conversations that have to be had. We know that there are microaggressions that happen. We know that there is implicit bias. I own my own implicit bias. I really do. And I think we all have to be able to have these conversations. The disproportionate, amount of remediation that students are able to either get through or not. And then we do know that there are groups of students that are marginalized. But being able to have these honest conversations, you can look at, like, where is it that we're giving them the same tool, but yet because of all of these systemic things that are in place, they're really not the same, the tool that we're giving them. And so being able to acknowledge that from an equity lens, I think is really important. And then we think, well, maybe we can just get more and bring in diversity. Let's just bring in more. And we'll open up our doors to more students. Well, no, but we're not taking care of the pathway and the tools that students have. So when we think about what can we do, right? So as we're really thinking about equity, what are the tools that we need as institutions to think about reimagining the student experience with an equity lens? We need to begin to ask ourselves, what is the regular disaggregated data and analysis that we do? And it's not just about getting the data, because I can tell you that to this day, I'm still getting like these Excel spreadsheets with thousands and thousands of lines that I can't do any of it. But what's the analysis behind it? What does it tell me about my group of students? I mentioned earlier, like, we're 90% Latino. So what does equity look like for me if I can't use ethnicity, right? Well, we know, for example, at the university, this is new data that we're looking at to try and understand who are our students so that we can differentiate our services for them using equity mindedness, right? So one of the things that we began to look at is 60% of our students at the university, first time in college students, are coming to us with significant dual credit. I don't know if you all are aware, but the Valley delivers about 20% of the dual credit for the state of Texas. And it has about 20% of the early college high schools for the state of Texas. So one thing that surprised me is that it's as low as it is, that only 60% are coming, but 40% of them are still coming with zero dual credit, which means that those 40% students are not getting some kind of early experience and connection to a college of some kind, right? Well, when we began to look at that data for us, there is a 10 to 12% difference in first year retention and credits accumulated in GPA in the first year for students coming with dual credit versus those that are not. That's significant for us. So as an institution, we need to now rethink, well, what does that mean for how we onboard them in orientation? Should a student with zero credits be coming in to the exact same orientation and advising as the student coming in with 60 credits? And I would say no. So part of our equity journey is to think about who are our students and what does that mean? And so our QEP this year is really about differentiated advising for retention and timely progress to degree completion. Because we are now convinced through our data that part of our equity issue is understanding who our students are up front as a predominantly Latino serving institution, and differentiating between what it means for our students. So we're looking at the number of credits that they're coming with, whether they are adults. Even within students with dual credit, we're beginning to see differences if they went to an early college high school versus whether they just did traditional dual credit. We're beginning to really say, so the desegregation for us and the analysis that we need to do is a little different. The goal setting and action planning is really important, because as we're looking at our data, we just worked with our Office of Institutional Research and Reporting. We found that that if the students are coming in not just with zero credits, but also with dual credit, but also whether they oh my God, I had a little brain hiccup. But also, we're comparing it to if they go see an advisor, how are they doing? And we are looking if they come into us college ready versus having to start, because we still get about 600 to 900 students that need to do a jump start in the summer that are almost college ready, but not yet. If they're college ready or not, how are they doing? And there is a difference of, and this was striking to us, that if a student saw an advisor even once in the first term, the difference of those that do and don't is 39% of those that did not see an advisor re-enroll for the following term or the following year, as compared to 89% of students that do see an advisor. And so when we're beginning to track and look at what are the things that really are making an impact on students, when we really began to look at that data, this is the result that it can have for an institution. Our president has committed to giving us 32 new advisors. We just hired 16 new advisors this fall with a promise that we're hiring 16 more next summer so that we're ready for fall 20, would it be 2020 to have and move from a ratio of 550 to 1 to about 320 to 1. That is huge. But as we are able to disaggregate the data, able to say that this is why, being able to assess and all of that. And then more importantly, being able to have equity-driven discussions and training with our faculty and staff to talk about, why is differentiation needed? And I will tell you that one of the lessons learned that we had in having our advising team think about, we gave them a shot to design the curriculum, to think about the benchmarks, to think about who the subgroup were. And it was really hard for them to step up a step higher and think about, well, what does that mean? Because they're so knee deep in the weeds in the work that they're doing. So it took some facilitation from someone who is not knee deep in advising to say, here are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves as we think about what that means if we're thinking about it from an equity-minded lens, right? And not just about how is advising different, but let's think about the equitable opportunity at re-enrollment, at successfully completing your courses and making good progress. And so to me, I've been learning a lot in this year as we think about what does it mean when you're thinking about it from an equity-minded lens. And so when we think about how to achieve student success, I love this quote here, and I'm going to just read it out loud. Achieving parity in educational outcomes for students of color requires that practitioners critically assess and change their practices to advance student equity. For this to happen, there must be a shared understanding that underperforming students, students of color, whatever you want to call that group, have been underserved with inadequate resources that limit their success. And so thinking about that really is about turning the mirror on ourselves, right? So what is it about what we're doing or not doing? You know, a student that is making really great progress, that has a 3.5 GPA, that is on target, they're doing everything that they need to. And as we look at our advising plan form with EAB Navigate, they show up as green. Do we really need to have an hour advising session with them? Is the curriculum that we talk to them about the same as a student that is in our red and yellow zone that may not be showing up to class, that may have some other issues, that may not be completing the courses that they attempt? Or is that curriculum, you know, and the way that we attach the services to that student, do they need to be different? And so that's the kind of mindset I think that we're all having to switch to and think about it. So to continue this is like, as we think about increasing student success amongst these populations, it really takes a countering interpretation that failed to notice racial inequities and providing more resources and support for students who have not received it. So when we think about the statement, we care about all students, what does that mean? And what does that mean for the students that do come to us from under-resourced communities, from underrepresented communities? I will tell you that having done the collective impact work in a 4,213 square mile, 37 school districts, 4 institutions of higher ed area for 5 years, the biggest equity issue that the Rio Grande Valley has is the school district's ability and access to partnerships. We still have school districts that don't have access to a higher ed partners dual credit, that are partnering on online programs with universities from outside the valley, and their students are failing miserably. We have students that don't have access to internships because there are no companies for them to do internships with. Although the district that's 15 minutes north of them have access to all kinds of hospitals and businesses that are willing to do internships with them. So as we think about equity, we really need to begin to think about it beyond like our own things, right? So like I said, for us in the Valley, I believe our greatest equity issue is access to partnerships and resources in our community. The other thing is, if you go to the centers, not the center, but these authors here, when you look at their work and when they think about equity by design, what are some of the principles? And I know the Center for Urban Education talks about equity mindedness also, and have like tremendous resources about that. It's really important for us to have clarity in language, goals, and measures, right? It's really, really important. Like we were having a conversation this morning about what does it mean to do degree progress checks? Like we're challenging ourselves to every semester that we meet with our students to kind of do a pulse and say, how are they making progress to degree? But when our executive team talks about degree progress checks, they're really talking about the degree audit process, a very technical process. And so we need to operationally define in our institutions that we're all talking about the same thing, so that as we're establishing goals and measures, we're being measured on the same thing and we are having the same conversation. And then equity mindedness should be guiding the paradigm of the language and action, right? So as we think about, like I said, who are my subgroups? I know when I started here almost a year and a half ago, that was the first question that I asked, who are our students? And the first thing that folks gave me was the traditional profile. X number are full-time, X number are part-time, X number are female, X number are Latino, X. I'm like, no. I know that. I read your fact book. Tell me who our students are. Like what are the demographics of our students? Who are they? And what do we know about them? So it's really important to be able to develop language around that and be able to think about it from an equity mindedness lens. And then it's really important that our practices and our policies are designed to accommodate differences in context and learning, right? That we're not treating all the students like this is one huge conversation. I don't know if you all are having this conversation, but we are beginning to have really serious conversations about what does it mean to serve students that have learning disabilities that are not seen. You know, the unseen learning disability. And we have federal laws and we have state laws that require that we do certain things. And I don't know about your institution, but we have a handful of students that are really challenging our processes about what it means to have an accessible classroom, what it means to have an accessible curriculum and materials. And so as we're talking to our faculty about, you know, yes, you have it online, but do you have it when you're doing a video? Are you captioning it? If you're creating your own PowerPoints, if you're creating your own, offering your own materials, is it accessible online in the same way with the same requirements that are out there? And I will tell you that right now the federal law does not hold publishers accountable for any of this. We are accountable. And so as we have these conversations, instead of having them from a compliance standpoint, if we begin to have them from an equity standpoint, we can begin to move the needle, I believe, much quicker and stronger to meet our student needs. And so as we continue the journey on the principles and we talk about enacting equity requires a continual process of learning, disaggregating data, questioning assumptions about relevance and effectiveness, one of the hardest things that we're having right now, for example, with our advising team, is they're so tired of change. And as they think about change, they're pushing back. And I'm not saying anything to you I wouldn't say in front of them, because we have these really honest conversations in our staff. But when they talk about it, they're always saying like, we're so done, like at least let us have it and let's institutionalize something and then let's move forward. But our world is evolving so quickly that we're not just changing for the sake of changing, we're responding and we're tweaking, we're responding and we're tweaking. And if something doesn't work, we have a responsibility to reassess it. And so one of the things that we're looking at is how do we develop these cultures, not of constant change, but cultures of assessment, cultures of curiosity and inquiry, of wanting to know what's working and not working, because that means that we have to make investments in training and retraining and investments in just having conversations and using data as a flashlight and not as a hammer, right? So that if the data isn't going in the direction that we're hoping, that we're not asking the why question from a punishment standpoint, or you're not doing your job, but let's think about the why in, did we do it with fidelity? Did we have a misstep, or maybe this is just the wrong thing to do with this set of students? And so it's about being able to have your practices and your policies, you know, be able to stand up to the scrutiny of the mirror of equity, right? Or equity mindedness. And then it has to be system wide, because, you know, it become, if equity is somebody's job in the corner silo, then it's nobody's job and the impact won't happen. And you can look at at all of our institutions, and if you have an equity officer or diversity officer, then is it only that person's responsibility to ensure that there's equity across our different student groups? You know, we have to ask ourselves those questions. And then, so here's some things to consider and think about as you're thinking about equity mindedness. Here's a couple of things that if you haven't asked yourself these questions, it might be interesting for you to ask yourselves as we get off of the webinar, right? Like, Do you routinely examine reports and data on who participates in your honors programs? Who gets your institutional scholarships? Who gets your undergraduate scholarships? Who's participating in your internships and other work-based experience? Who are consistently, participating in your focus groups and in your surveys? And so then the other thing is, have you adopted equity indicators? And do you examine them routinely? Do you discuss them? Do you go through a process of assessing them? Do you look at your policies or practices, or do you just look at our students doing what they're supposed to? Do you ask the next question of what policy or practice may be inhibiting or supporting student success, right? Do you understand the impact of these policies on different subgroups? Like the students coming in with 0 credits versus those coming in with significant dual credit. Do you routinely engage in diverse groups of students to understand the student experience? Or are we always pulling on the student employees? Are we always pulling on the student government, on the student clubs, because they're just accessible to us? And I'm telling you, these are hard things to do because we experience it on a daily basis. The other thing is to move from lagging indicators to leading indicators. Great, track your graduation rate, your fall to fall retention, all of these things are really important. But do you look at how students are doing in beginning their coursework in the first term, completing their remediation in the first year? One of the biggest indicators, this is the other big indicator that we're looking at. Another subgroup that we're looking at is students that complete math and English, college level math and English in the first year are like almost 2 to 3 times more likely to be successful than students that don't here at the university. The research supports that. Have you looked at that? Like, are your processes guiding students towards making good academic behaviors, right? The credit accumulation, huge predictor of student success, students who complete 80% of their coursework successfully, students who continue in the summer to earn credits. I mean, all of these are things that if you're not looking at as in leading indicators would be really great things for you to look at, and then to look at it from an equity lens. This tool here is a really great tool for facilitating engagement in dialogue. For me, I've been using this tool since it was created by the authors on really engaging folks in making sense of the data. The really cool thing about this toolkit is that it includes 21 different activities that you can use to engage people in dialogue. It gives you, so the toolkit gives you a couple of pages for each of the activities that you can use. Better yet, it tells you, when to use it. For example, there are 3 reasons why we engage people. One is to promote a greater understanding or awareness of something. Another reason is to generate new ideas and or solutions. And the third is to make a decision. And if you don't understand what the goal is for your meeting, then I'm not sure that you're leaving with what the intended outcome is. So this helps you kind of plan for those. This has been one of the best tools that I've come into in the last few years to help us have really effective meetings. And so I use gallery walks a lot. I use placemats a lot. I combine a lot of these. And if you just begin to use some of these things in your own daily meetings and things, it becomes the way that you do business. I just did this with 300 of our I oversee about 300 full-time employees, and in our winter convening, we used a placemat, we used Think, Pair, Share, and we did the 1 minute response. And so there's lots of these that you can combine to be able to get large numbers of people to participate in making sense of things. And so when we think about equity, there's lots of work that we can do. It's being discussed in many ways. My wish for you is that your institution is already on its way to doing a lot of really good work, and that all I've done is shared with you some additional tools that you can use at your institution to help to help even do more. Because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, it really is about this, being able to have our kids and their families celebrate their success. And so I know that I just said a lot with a lot of material, but if there's any questions, I'm open to answering them.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Canales. That was wonderful. I think that for so much of the work that we do, it's just a very good reminder to have periodically to sort of recenter practice and things like that. And so there were a couple of questions during the presentation that I'll go ahead and ask. So one is, why would you say that we lose so many teachers in our K-12 system?
So what we heard through focus groups and engagement of teachers is that they don't feel like there's good onboarding for them. They show up in a classroom and they're not prepared for the daily classroom management issues, interactions with parents. They're just not prepared. And so a lot of this, we have to take responsibility at the university and our colleges of education and really understanding those things. And so we're having to reimagine what student teaching looks like. Remember, we give students 1 semester of student teaching traditionally. We're moving into residency models now, where we are placing 3 to 5 teachers in a district that makes a commitment to hire at least 75% of them at the end of their 1-year residency, and to really assign mentors to them. A lot of the school districts are beginning to offer 3-year onboarding for their teachers, where they're creating academies so that they don't feel isolated, right? So a lot of it is that they don't feel fully prepared. They're not they once they get to our schools, they don't feel like they're really prepared to do what they need to do.
Thank you. A second question that I have is, are dual enrollment students accumulating too many hours?
So there's a couple of issues, and I can tell you, I worked in the community college sector for 18 years, the university 10 years before that. Now I'm back at the university, right? And even the 5 years that I did collective impact work, I don't know that there's a solid yes or a solid no answer, which is not a cop out, but let me explain why. Our early college high schools and the TA is really encouraging students just to finish some associate degree or something, right? A credential, or to finish the core is what we wish they were also telling them, but they don't have the same amount of points. What we're noticing a trend is that many of our kids that are graduating from high school with an associate's degree are being packaged into these associate degrees in interdisciplinary studies because there's not an intentional pathway for the student. So the students are coming to the universities with these associate degrees in interdisciplinary studies that may or may not be aligned, let's say, with their business degree that they want or their engineering degree. And so that in itself is creating, I think, a little bit of excess credits for the students. But then there are others. I'll give you an example. We were working with one of our school districts, and I won't mention their name, but when we sat down with the superintendent, we were shocked to learn that they were working with 4 institutions of higher ed. There are 11 universities delivering educational services in the Rio Grande Valley. And not all of them have campuses in the valley, but there is a university that's doing online dual credit, and we're finding that the success rates of those students are really, really low. So it's impacting their financial aid ability as they enter. We have another, well, we all know UT Systems is doing the on-ramps. There are other universities that are sending faculty to so there's all these models. So when I asked the superintendent, okay, so do you know how many credit students are accruing in this as you partner with these 4 institutions? They don't. Senate Bill 25 is going to change all of that because school districts are going to be forced to keep track of the credit students are accumulating. the course program of study that the feds are now beginning to tighten up on is going to force us to begin to say no to some dual credit, because as we think about what students are coming to us with, it's going to push their financial aid in many different ways. And so I would say there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to understand it. I know in our community, we're looking at it really seriously, and we're having conversations with our community college partners and with our school districts about what does it mean. And when I was talking earlier about the articulation agreements, those are on us, the university also. And so there's a lot of work to be done on alignment to make sure that whatever dual credit students are accumulating transfers seamlessly to whatever four-year institution they go to also. I hope that answered it. It might have been too much.
No, I think that was great. Also, you mentioned that there was data to say that if students saw an advisor in their first semester, that the retention rate was as high as about 89% versus 39%. Do you have
Here at our university?
Okay, that
it's
was
our own internal data. It's our data that we're using to track the impact of advising on certain groups of students.
Perfect. Was there anything else?
No, but if anyone wants to know more about what we're doing with advising, I'm really proud of the work we're doing with advising. There's my contact information. Kick me out an email and I'm happy to connect with you over the phone.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'll give a couple of seconds to see if anybody wants to raise their hand, but we are at 4:01, so I don't want to I don't want to push too much of people's time. So thank you so much for a really informative presentation on equity and for that shot in the arm to recenter our practice.
Thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Alrighty, and that will conclude the webinar. So thank you very much, everyone, and we will look forward to seeing you on February 20th. If you have any questions or anything, please feel free to shoot me an email. And otherwise, thank you very much for attending and have a great rest of your day.